My name is Jocelyn Forbush. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Trustees, and we are delighted to have you with us this evening. Tonight's topic is designing for equity and engaging diverse communities. As some of you may know, this event was originally scheduled to take place in the second week of March earlier this year. We unfortunately had to postpone due to the outbreak of COVID-19 in the city of Boston. And we're excited to finally hold this conversation, but would love nothing more than to be together in person. The title and speakers for this particular event have not changed since March, but as you all know, there's been significant change in the context for this evening, given both the ongoing health crisis, as well as the social justice movement we're experiencing across the country in the wake of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. Our focus on equity and belonging is and will continue to be heightened as we mobilize our One Waterfront Initiative, which has set out to create iconic open space in the heart of Boston's harbor that is designed and purposefully built to be a resilient space for people from all corners of the city of Boston and hopefully also around the world. So through our One Waterfront Initiative, we've continued to seek the answer to one of our founder, Charles Elliott's key questions, which is how do we make our waterfront an accessible resource for everyone? As we have looked for new waterfront park opportunities around the city, we've thought about how we can provide the physical and mental health opportunities of open space broadly. And we're thinking about how we can provide access in communities where open space has been limited. And finally, we're exploring what it means to provide a public space that is accessible to all, and even more importantly, a space where we all feel like we belong. We're thinking about the where of this work and what park spaces will best serve our community. And we've been thinking about the how. How will future parks attract users from all parts of Boston? Many of whom live very close to the water, but don't think of the waterfront as theirs, or they don't feel like they have safe access to it. And how can we engage diverse points of view in the design of a new park or in the public programs that we run there? Our panelists tonight have years of experience with creating places, programs, and systems that seek to achieve more equitable outcomes that are typically found in our world today. Our hope for this evening is to hear their thoughts on some of the circumstances that have brought us to this moment, to learn from other places that are going through similar revitalizations, and to understand in a local context how we can work together to build a more equitable Boston and to mobilize public open space as a catalyst to not only bring us together, but to make us healthier and happier. We have a fantastic lineup of panelists for you tonight, and we look forward to hearing their thoughts on design, on equity, on how we can better engage with people in our communities. But before we get started, let me address a few housekeeping notes for everyone. Tonight's program will be simultaneously interpreted into Spanish. If you'd like to make use of this service, you will see an interpretation globe on the bottom right of your panels. Please press on the globe and select your language channel from the drop-down menu, either English or Spanish. If you're using your smartphones, please select more and follow the same steps. We also want to hear from you throughout our session. Because we can't be in the same room tonight, we have employed a number of interactive features that will help us hear from you. Throughout the conversation, we'll be asking for your participation with polls, word clouds, and by submitting questions for panelists. To do this, simply go to slido.com. So Slido, SLIDO.com, here on the screen, on your mobile device or computer, and type in the keyword One Waterfront, all one word. There's no need to register or to log in. Here you can toggle back and forth between Q&A and polls, the two menu items at the top. Feel free to submit as many questions as you'd like throughout the discussion and upvote any questions you'd like answered, as our panelists will respond to as many as they can at the end. You can choose to remain anonymous or add your name to the discussion. We will also have live polls for you to participate in throughout the program, so I hope you'll do that and lend your voice to the discussion. And now to our program. Tonight's Building One Waterfront Forum will be moderated by Shelley Sylva, who's Senior Vice President and Head of Social Impact for TD Bank. And in this role, Shelley leads TD Bank's corporate and social responsibility strategy, the TD Ready Commitment. Prior to joining TD, Shelley spent nearly a decade at the Philadelphia Housing Authority, rising to the role of Assistant Executive Director, where she helped reshape Philadelphia's housing landscape. TD Bank and the TD Ready Commitment are our event sponsors this evening, and we are grateful for their ongoing support of our One Waterfront Initiative. We are delighted to have Shelley joining us this evening to lead this important discussion. And so Shelley, over to you.
Thank you, Jocelyn, for such a warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. I think this discussion is going to be quite lively, quite educational, and we're going to leave with some clear action steps to take back to our everyday work. So a little bit about the TD Ready Commitment and why TD would be sponsoring an initiative like One Waterfront. TD has committed $1 billion towards community giving by 2030 because we recognize we play a key role in helping to create a more inclusive and sustainable future for all. We advance our corporate citizenship platform through 4 drivers of change: financial security, where we look to increase opportunities for people to improve their financial standing; vibrant planet, to help elevate the quality of our environment so that people and economies can thrive; connected communities, to create opportunities for everyone to participate and be included in their community; and better health. We look to support more equitable health outcomes for all. As you can imagine, when COVID-19 hit, TD was well positioned through our TD Ready Commitment to respond in real, meaningful ways to support all of the communities in which we operate. But today's discussion, why are we here? Why is TD bringing these experts together to have this type of discussion? For us, our commitment is bigger than giving money. We recognize that we need to dialogue around key and critical issues that drive change in today's society. Building for a more equitable and engaging diverse communities is something that's core to our Ready Commitment. And so there is no other place I would be on a Tuesday evening but with this esteemed panel to discuss this topic. So before we get started, we're going to use this Slido, and Nick has warned me, stick to the script and let's do the Slido stuff. So my first question for the audience is, where are you joining us from tonight? So please shout out your city, your town, your neighborhood. We want to know who's in the room with us tonight, our virtual room. Okay, we got Westwood, Charlestown, Salem, okay. Rhode Island in the house. I do not see Philadelphia, so my mother has not joined yet. I have to send her a reminder. Jamaica Plain, okay, Holyoke, Andover, Connecticut. They're coming in. So what I can say about this list is that we have a diverse group of stakeholders in East Boston. That's where the majority of our folks are from this evening. And so now we're going to get started with our conversation. And so I'm going to introduce our first speaker, April D. Simone. April has over 15 years of experience in strategically designing, developing, and launching for-profit, nonprofit, and government projects. Continuing to advocate for social innovation, Ms. D. Simone is co-creator of various for-purpose ventures and initiatives that promote market-based solutions to address complex social challenges. A Dean Merit Scholar, she recently completed her Master of Science in Design and Urban Ecologies from Parsons, the New School for Design. Ms. Simone continues to be recognized for her leadership and dedication in supporting frameworks that promote a just and equitable society. April, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Shelley. A big smile of appreciation to the One Waterfront team for convening such an important topic, given the climate we're in, and a nod of appreciation to my fellow panelists for this evening's talk. So thank you. I've been interrogating this word design equity or equity since I was born, I will say. Coming from the Bronx, growing up in a neighborhood where 80 to 90% of the housing stock was burned, and really trying to understand these socio-spatial dynamics and who made decisions of how we have arrived here. Growing up in that has really transferred into a professional space that when we begin to ask, what does equity mean within the built environment and how do we achieve it, has undergirded and really responded into my desire, along with many of my colleagues, to launch alternative models that allow us to really begin to delve into understanding. Next slide, please. When we look at deep systemic and entangled crises in our environment, housing affordability, climate, wealth disparities, a myriad of these conditions aren't anything new, and arguably we can say since the first boats landed on this continent. A lot of our work and a lot of the modeling and framework circles around a lot of the theory that comes out of systems change. Systems change includes an interplay between perception and mental models. Could the way we think about someone or something create a lived reality? Around connections, relationships, and power dynamics, and how these systems reflect mental models, and policies, practices, and investments. How do outputs influenced by conditions of mental models and the power dynamics shape the built environment that we're in? And in creating this lived experience, how does the interplay of these components reinforce systemic dynamics that, again, are played out in our very society today? Next slide, please. As a result, we launched Designing the We in 2015 and really wanted to prod design as a mechanism and as a tool. And we've created a theory of change around three components: reframing, redesigning, and reinvesting. And understanding that design isn't just creating a structure, an output, an infrastructure project. It really is a myriad of a transdisciplinary approach that really creates an imposition to the experiential experiences we go through as we navigate spaces within the built environment. Next slide, please. We've developed a myriad of tools from understanding that we need to have the pedagogy in place. We need to have alternative visions of design that really are centered around social impact and equity. And we need to have activations in different forms from what has traditionally happened. Next slide. So as I explained to many of you, we launched in the summer of 2015 with our Manifesto in Action, which is an exhibition that is called Undesign the Red Line. And it's a metaphorical projection into red lines within the community, but how have we arrived to these systems and what does it mean for where we are going? The next slide. We have traveled across the country. This is part of our exhibition. And as you can see, the top of this timeline really looks at how the systems integrate and intertwine with each other and what are outputs that it creates in the built environment. And the bottom of the timeline really is pushing back at these systems and what we have done from grassroots efforts to really cultivate, again, this concept of equity within the built environment. And became very, very important for us to really create a context. What we have found in many of the cities that we have traveled to, the intentionality of wanting to see equity within the built environment along racial, class, or any other ism that you pick. But oftentimes we don't understand the narrative of how we have arrived here. And it perpetuates thinking around people choose to live in the conditions they live in. We have put money into something, pull your bootstraps up. So I think it really becomes extremely important that we begin to navigate a contextualization and understanding of these red lines that reinforce a hierarchy of human value within the built environment. Next slide, please. So in understanding our theory of change, and at the core of that is reframing dominant narratives that have persisted over time and have controlled our again, desire to create equity within the built environment. I'm sharing a case study of how we've applied this reframing in places like Trenton, New Jersey, around a 2-acre parcel of land along the wave of urban farming, but really trying to delve in and involve the community in defining what urban farming or urban agriculture means. And a lot of the applications that we used, and one of the most prominent was contextualization. We found it incredibly interesting when we talked about the urban farm as an urban farm, there was not a lot of engagement or interests around that. But when we redefined it through contextualization of what has historically happened in this East Trenton community, which was sidelined and marginalized as a result of redlining policies from the New Deal and urban renewal that forcefully created this geographical footprint of hypersegregation in America today, people began to shift their thinking. And in this understanding, wanted to connect to a project that really they felt could redefine things like land tenure within their community. And it wasn't just a topical, can we get your Post-it note with what you feel? It really was creating a process that engaged people, not for the moment, but for the long term. And not only engaged them, but allowed them to become stewards of these types of projects that are happening in their own backyard. Next slide, please. The second component is redesigning in our theory of change. And in addition to having community forums and conversations, we took it to the street. We popped up the exhibition. We popped up formal and gatherings all through the corridors, in empty storefronts, in public libraries, in schools, all a myriad of different places to really try to accentuate the expanding of this sense of community and who's included at this table. And part of that whole contextualization with this deep understanding led to many of the opportunities of remodeling and visioning, and really sitting with architects and urban planners and community members, not through a hierarchy of we know better as experts and we're going to impose that on you, but what is it that you bring to the table, I bring to the table, and how do we develop not just a project, but an ecosystem that really is looking at unearthing systemic change within the built environment. Next slide, please. And then rather than just focusing on an urban farm, what now this project has buttressed into is looking at agriculture as an anchor asset within a community. And how do we explore models like community land trusts that remove speculative land off of a commodified market? How do we use that land and vet it through a participatory design process? How do we create economic stability and encourage ownership through cooperative models? For example, as you see the food truck, the farm cultivates and grows, the food truck uses some of that produce and then drives into corridors that are filled with a lot of the state offices and buildings where many people don't leave that 1 block radius of those state buildings. So how do you take economy and new concepts of healthy eating that are infused in all of these concepts into a place and into community? How do you look at tiered housing models? How do you look at investing in projects that have gone through a participatory design process that is centered on equity and inclusion? Next slide, please. So a couple of questions as I wrap up is, how do we invest in ongoing design processes within neighborhoods that seek to contextualize and use systemic racism and structural inequity as a design lens? As an architect in training, as an urbanist, I'm looking at how we apply skill sets and how do we invest in this. Projects like the one in Trenton were not funded by millions of dollars to come to these conclusions and work with communities. This was a concerted effort between Designing the We, community members, organizations like the Watson Institute. And for me, there was always this, in going through this process, a $750,000 pour-in for over 5 years to create this a vision that had no backing. We did it because it's the right thing to do. We weren't doing it based on us getting money to do this. It's because it's so necessary. And as I said in the beginning of my presentation, coming from the Bronx, it isn't that our communities are incapable of coming up with beautiful infrastructure projects or ecologies or things that benefit us. What has often failed to reach us are the resources necessary to not get the message co-opted and allow us to have ownership in envisioning our community. So I'll leave it with this slide and appreciate you listening. Thank you.
April, thank you for your presentation. I'm a note taker, and so there was lots of key things that I want to follow back up on when we go to the discussion, but stewardship by community partners, stewards, owners, creating a sense of community, reframing dominant narratives, developing an ecosystem. Thank you for that presentation. And I want to remind our participants that you can ask your questions via Slido at any time. Feel free to put a question in. If you want to direct one to a specific panelist, please, you can put their name on front of it and then ask the question. And so now we're going to hear from Mauricio Garcia. Mauricio is the Chief Program and Engagement Officer at Friends of the High Line, a nonprofit organization and a public park on the west side of Manhattan, devoted to reimagining public spaces to create connected, healthy neighborhoods and cities. Mauricio leads the High Line's programming and community engagement efforts that position the High Line as an active and responsive civic connector. Prior to the High Line, Mauricio served as the Deputy Director of Cities of Service, a nonprofit organization that helps mayors and other city leaders build stronger cities by engaging their best resource, their citizens. He was responsible for leading Cities of Service's support to its network of over 280 cities, including strategy, design, training, and technical assistance. Great to have you with us this evening, Mauricio.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, TD Bank. Thank you, I think I'm unmuted. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to the trustees, Boston Waterfront, to Atyia and April. This is fun. This is a fun conversation. And I look forward to speaking to everyone else a little bit later on. You can move on to the first slide. Yeah, so this, I want to just go a little bit off what I had planned a little bit. The High Line, you know, Shelley mentioned it, we are a public park, we are a nonprofit on the west side of New York City. We see ourselves first and foremost, of course, as a public space. We are a little, you know, we were kind of one of the first entities that repurposed underutilized, or in this case, unused infrastructure, a railway. We were a former railway that our two co-founders created to be able to become a public park. And this kind of, this image kind of shows that evolution from back in the day, where literally there was a West Side cowboy who was leading a train on the ground to be able to reach the northern parts of Manhattan. That soon became an elevated railway that was moving freight to warehouses. And it was underutilized, abandoned, and then today, this, not just the thriving public space with, you know, beautiful horticulture and art, but also around the High Line, this burgeoning development. And I'll get to that in a moment. And so because of that kind of lineage or those roots, there was something that was going on to be able to get us to this point. And that was being able to engage with our residents, with our partners. And so this conversion didn't happen at the snap of a finger. It required a lot of relationship building with a lot of different people. And so building those connections with residents was critically important. And being able to continue that relationship building. And so that's where the community engagement comes in, you know, engaging with diverse communities, particularly at that time on the west side of Manhattan. And so we were fortunate to be able to, our efforts were successful in that the High Line was saved, it was repurposed. It took about, you know, 10 or so years to be able to make it the park that it is today. And it's been around for, as a final park around 11 years. And so community engagement itself is in our roots. Community advocacy is in our roots. What we've learned along the way, and we've learned a lot, is that some of the community engagement that we did should have been nurtured a little bit more. There was more people to talk to. And those were lessons learned that oftentimes the folks aren't as candid about. And that's one of the things that we wanted to kind of look ourselves in the mirror and realize that there were things that we could have done. And there was certainly successes, but there are also some missteps that were made along the way. And so going back to the mission of the Highline, you know, it is our mission to reimagine the role of public space. We helped reimagine the Highline. We reimagined it. And like other underutilized infrastructure, it was done through a few different ways. It was done through the possibility of what might be. It was done through the power of people. It was done, you know, the power of place. A lot of people really kind of focus on place and the experience. And we're pretty proud of the experience people have on the Highline, even today, where our experience has changed so dramatically because of the pandemic. Next slide, please. And, you know, one of the things about the Highline is that we are a free, open, accessible public space with art, horticulture, we have programming. But one of the things that we see ourselves first and foremost as is a neighborhood anchor. We see ourselves as an anchor institution that plays an outsized role, not just in the west side of Manhattan, but throughout New York City. And with that role comes a lot of responsibility to our neighbors and to our communities, and to all our communities. That's the key thing here. Over the years, some of you may know, the Highline has helped generate a lot of value on the west side of Manhattan. The rezoning that took place on the west side, all the new developments, you know, it was the meatpacking district was called the meatpacking district for a reason. And so there's a lot of responsibility that comes with being that kind of outsized presence. And there were certainly moments where there was less engagement and less equity. Equity wasn't top of mind back in those times. And we can say that now, but it has been for the Highline over the last several years. But it was something that was kind of coming naturally, and we didn't have kind of a peer group of, you know, infrastructure reuse is the word we use, partners around the country to go to and be able to ask those questions. But what we did have was relationships, and we were building trust with some of our neighbors, and we were going to them and asking them for their input, going back to them, letting them know how we use their input and repeat. And that was part of the success of the Highline, is that we were nurturing those relationships, building new ones, and along the way, hoping to build that trust. And that's been constant ever since. And this is just one example of how we actually convene folks on the Highline. And if you go to the next slide, please. We realize as a community anchor, we can't just be on the Highline. We have to get off the Highline. We have to extend, as I mentioned before, some of the value that we help generate off the Highline, and that's through workforce development initiatives, that's through youth training, that's through education, that's through interpreting the art that we have on the Highline to the folks who may not be able to go see it. And we also recognize, and we've done a series of different surveys and conversations and held dialogue with our neighbors. While they might love that the Highline is there and they're very proud of the Highline being there, oftentimes they say, well, that's not for us, or that's for the folks coming from out of town. And so for us, it's critically important to change that narrative. And it's been critically important to change that narrative and make the Highline feel as if it is their backyard park, even though I realize that it may be challenging given the nature of the Highline. But again, the key thing here is that engagement is the cornerstone. But over the years, we've also reflected quite a bit. It's been a long time, and we've reflected on some of those missteps I've talked about. Equity there's been some gaps there in the past. And over the last 5 or 6 years, we made a concerted effort to look within first around the equity issues, to be able to be a better partner externally around issues of equity and diversity and inclusion. And so we've committed resources, we've committed time around that, but we know there was a lot of questions that we didn't have. And along the way, other groups of infrastructure reuse projects projects like the 606 in Chicago, projects such as 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C. have come to us knocking on our doors asking, how did you do that? Or what was the response to this? What did you learn about this other thing? And in some cases, we were able to answer those questions, but in others, we didn't have an answer. And in fact, we were learning from those other groups. And so we were getting so many of those, and we were seeing this kind of critical mass, and you can move to the next slide, please. There was a critical mass of these conversations that were happening where, one, infrastructure was being left abandoned or underutilized around the country. Two, there were people who wanted to kind of follow in some way around the Highline's footsteps to be able to repurpose that for greater good, a civic asset, a public space. And so we decided a few years ago to be able to take all those lessons learned from our community engagement, from the equity conversations, from our own experience, but also be able to coalesce around this idea of creating public space, designing public space, and using perhaps both our successes and our missteps to be able to inform how to do that better, and learning from these peers. And so, as I said, a few years ago, we organized something called the Highline Network, which today is made up of 39 projects around the country, a couple from north of the border in Canada, and one new from Mexico City. And this group is meant to be a peer learning group, to be able to talk about kind of where they're at both from the economic development side, but as well as the public space design more generally, public programming, different, housing, workforce, things of that nature, public art. And so this group serves as kind of a safe space for folks to talk about things, but also one of the things we've been able to focus on from the very beginning, and again, this stems from our learnings as the Highline, is around equity. And so one of the first, and we had actually April speak at our symposium last year around Undesign the Red Line. And so one of the things that we recognize is that we needed to, because so many of our partners and so many of our projects were in early phases in their life cycle, we wanted to be able to get at the core of equity right at the very beginning. So we launched a pilot called the Equity Impacts Framework, in partnership with the Urban Institute and the Harvard Graduate School of Design, to be able to think through how do we measure this very tough concept of equity in the economic development process. We're in the first phase of a pilot where we're receiving 9 projects, including the Highline, are receiving coaching from the Urban Institute and the Harvard GSD. So next year, I hope to come back and be able to share some findings from that. And one other thing that we do as a network is we support one another. That's a big part. Some of the things that we're doing are uncharted. And so when the pandemic has been uncharted for everyone, and so as soon as that happened, a lot of public spaces were stressed with staying open, being the one place folks can go to ensure social distancing. And some of our projects there were staff concerns, there were just safety concerns in general. So we had weekly conversations with all 39 projects to be able to kind of walk through kind of what is the Quinter Cut in Detroit doing, what is the Gathering Place in Tulsa doing. And you can move to the next slide. And part of this convening, part of this kind of thought partnering is to be able to talk about those things in a way that allows us to make advancements in not just public space design, but ensuring that equity is built into that design process, making sure that when it comes to equity, it doesn't just fall on the shoulders of the community engagement people, which is often the case, that equity is it's embedded in the fabric of an organization, and you know it from whether it's a community benefits agreement, if it's procurement policies or workforce, or the way that you actually message your words, your messaging around your park itself. And so you can move to the next slide. I'll just leave you with one last slide here. This is the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C. And I was going to bring this up a little bit later, but they are really one of the shining examples in the network of how to really build in equity from the planning phase, just the brainstorming phase of a project, to the actual implementation of different programming and things. They're not even done. They're not even done in the process of completing the park, but they've been able to be very deliberative and thoughtful on how to engage folks in this process, how to be equitable in that process as well, so that when it does go live, it has a lot of different, you can see the community's voice and desires that come through that particular project. So thank you, and I hope I didn't take too much time.
No, that was perfect, Mauricio. If I were going to put a title on your presentation, it would be, just because you build it doesn't mean they will come, right? Like, you shared a lot of information about the importance of real and community engagement, that you have to do it at the beginning, it can't be an afterthought, and that working with partners to drive best practices is something that we need to do as we build. And so thank you for sharing your thoughts, and I have some really good questions for you after we hear from our last panelist, Dr. Atyia Martin. Dr. Martin, thank you for joining us tonight. She is the CEO and founder of All Aces, Inc., an alternative to traditional diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting and professional development. Instead, All Aces is a racial equity applied learning, REAL, partner for organizations with a mission to activate consciousness and catalyze critical thinking and transform capabilities that advance racial equity and build resilience. Her previous professional roles include Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston, Director of the Office of Public Health Preparedness at the Boston Public Health Commission, and adjunct faculty in the Master of Homeland Security and Public Policy programs at Northeastern University. Thank you for joining us this evening, Dr. Martin.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Shelley. We appreciate you. Thank you to my fellow panelists, Mauricio and April. It's always a pleasure to be in company with folks who have spent time in developing the language and frameworks for how we engage with equity, what it means, and how we operationalize it. So thank you for your leadership, and thank you for having me. So I went back and forth on what to say this evening. And so there are some major points I want to make sure that I hit. Number one, that what we're really talking about when it comes to equity is addressing inequities, right? There's a reason why we're trying to work towards equity. And so for me, my focus is on racial equity as the entry point into looking at all the different types of inequities that we have in communities, particularly in urban environments. And so for us to have a conversation about, well, what do we do to embed equity? I think it's important for us to understand what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve for, which in the context of racial equity is racism. And so for this conversation, understanding that racism is more than bad apples, it's more than hating someone, that in fact it's a historically rooted system that has a whole set of dehumanizing ideologies or ideas about who white people are supposed to be and who people of color are supposed to be. And within each of those frames of how people are supposed to be, those frames of inferiority and powerlessness for people of color are boxes that we get locked into. And for white people, those boxes that white people get locked into is superiority and power. And that in both instances, for different reasons, we are both harmed in terms of being able to reach our full human potential because of the limitations and restrictions of what those boxes mean for who we think we are and how we show up in the world. Those ideas also are important because many of the ways that they show up inside of us as people is that we internalize those ideas about who we think people are, whether we believe them or not. You don't have to believe them in order to have them impact our behavior. And in fact, it's almost like a virus, like, which is a awful, unfortunate analogy, but since we're in COVID-19 times, but the reality is nobody wants COVID-19, but people still get infected with it anyways, whether we want to or not. And it's the same thing with these ideas about racism, these ideas that reinforce racism. So once they get inside of us, they operate behind the scenes. And if we don't have the knowledge, skills, and tools to manage ourselves, to understand how we work, why we do what we do, we show up in spaces, we interact with other people, and treat them in the ways that we think, or treat them in ways that reflect who we think they are as opposed to who they are. And we also have institutions, we show up in organizations with that internalization, with those ideas, with those interactions, and then we layer policies and practices on top of it. So the idea of the system that we all keep talking about shifting, I want to be explicit that it includes us as human beings, like us as people are part of the system that we're talking about. So with that context of the problem we're trying to solve for is super complicated. And so being respectful of how complicated it is, that complexity is real, and we love to simplify things as human beings. And so we have to work really hard not to do that, especially when it comes to something so layered and complicated as racism. So how does it work in real life when it comes to engagement and design? So in the present day context of what happens, oftentimes what we see is the main way that oppression kind of manifests itself, whether it's racism or other forms of oppression, is people's voice and choice is taken away from them. I never have the ability to be heard, and what I want doesn't happen, right? And there's no possibility of either of those things, my voice and my choice, actually having any influence on what's happening in my world, in my community, in my organization. And so when we talk about design, one of the powerful things about the stories that April and Mauricio told is that they bring us back to this idea of relationships, of making sure that we're making investments in communities. So if we're talking about racism as the problem we're trying to fight against and voice and choice being a part of that, then the work that we have to do to integrate equity into the whole planning process becomes even more paramount. And so what does that mean? So as we think about the challenges that we face with this idea of community engagement, oftentimes we think community engagement is outreach, right? Like if we just let people know, then we've done engagement, and it's not the same thing. And when we think about the process that we want to engage people in, that we're talking about right from the beginning. And from the beginning, that means the beginning of the planning process, before we've made any decisions. We're including them from the beginning, which requires us to have people as part of the problem definition. So what is it through this design process are we trying to solve for, right? So right from the beginning. So that as we go through that process of building those relationships, that we're able to make the necessary investments so that communities can build their capabilities to be in partnership with us as we are trying to do work in communities. And so I think it's important for us to also understand that for us to do the work of advancing racial equity and advancing social justice writ large, that a lot of this really is about how the things that we think and do. And in order to bring equity into the whole process, we have the beyond planning, beyond problem definition. Now we're getting into the actual design and engagement of people throughout that design process. And so as we're doing that, that requires an investment. It requires an ongoing investment. It's not ideally, this is not a one-time thing where we're doing an engagement, for this particular project. So we're going to go in, we're going to do engagement, then we're going to bungee out. And in an ideal world, what we would be doing is developing long-term relationships with communities, making investments to build the type of civic infrastructure that allows folks to be in full partnership with government, with organizations, community-based organizations, with other design organizations, architecture firms, all the different folks who are players that we actually have those relationships with the community already in place. And what's really powerful about the opportunities that we have that I think we are missing is that it actually saves us a lot of time and pain on the front end or on the back end rather. So usually what we do is we make a decision, we reach out to some people and we say, yeah, we engage with the community, we check a box, we had some meetings, without regard for the fact that everyone doesn't have the same time privilege, right? And so when it comes to underestimated communities, underestimated people across the country, there's a time and an equity there. People do not have the time to invest in things unless they know that it's going to be worth their time. And so that gets to one of the barriers that we have when we're coming into communities, which is the fact that there is serious distrust, because you're like the 1,000th group that's come in to ask them for, you know, their everything, what's your blood type, your social, like give me everything about you, with no return on investment, whether it's financial investment, whether it's, do I even get to see the final outcome of the thing that we were talking about? Do I get any benefits from the final outcome of the thing that we did? And then throughout that process, I think it was Mauricio who mentioned contracting for equity. I might have that wrong. I apologize if I have that wrong. But this idea of, from the beginning of that process, we should also be spending our money on that process, on the design process, on the community engagement process with people in the communities that we're engaging, right? So the food that we buy, the translation services, like all of those things, all of that money should be reinvested back into the community. And then this last piece around, you know, what kind of analyses do we need to partner with communities on doing to make sure we all understand the trade-offs of different aspects of the project. So doing a burdens benefit analysis, right? Which requires us to look at data by race, which requires us to get comfortable with talking about why there are these differences, which, to April's point, is not about individual choices. Which is why it's important to know the history, the type of history that April and her team help people to better understand, and all the other history that surrounds it, plus what's happening today right now. That context helps us to understand that we all exist in a larger context. And so on that topic of context, that we understand that, yes, we are the content experts. We come in with all of the technical knowledge, with the sometimes the process knowledge, if on the government side, and the regulatory stuff and all of those pieces. However, the community, they're the context experts. They're the ones who have the other half of the equation, and without that, it is an incomplete thought process. It's an incomplete process without that information in that context, because oftentimes there are many residents who have been there long before anybody in that government organization or community-based organization or planning or design firm showed up. They were there before. They can tell you the stories of how all of the previous decades of attempts to do the same thing that you're trying to do, it was just called a different name. So they can help unpack why certain things didn't work and where we have opportunities to make things work better. And then the last thing I'll say as we transition is the onus is on us to build the trust with community partners. We've been talking about it in a way that, you know, we're like, okay, you know, we need to do these things. This equitable approach to engaging and partnering with communities is hard. Like, it's not easy because of the trust we have to overcome, because of the distrust that we have to overcome. And it's not mistrust. I want to make sure we're good on our language, because there's evidence for them not to trust the process or the folks showing up. And so in order to work through that, that's where the relationships come in, authentic, genuine relationships. And the more sustained they are over time, the more the trust there is, the more we can do work, meaningful collaborative work together. And so I'll land here, which is, I started with this idea that we as people are part of the system that we talk about dismantling, which means that we have to confront ourselves as well. So there's the organizational decisions and policies and how we invest in communities or don't, all of those pieces. And it's us as people who are the ones who are making those decisions. And so who we are when we show up as individuals in community, in our organizations matter. And so when I think about how we advance racial equity from that kind of ideological, internalized to personal perspective, what we're really talking about is knowledge, skills, and tool building. No one needs to, we don't need to change anyone, right? What we need to do is get the information that helps us have a better, more nuanced understanding to respect the complexity of real life, and that there are differences, that we can have shared humanity, shared struggles, and we can have different experiences and different realities all at the same time. And life is real and life is complicated. So for those skills that we need to build as individuals quickly, it's racial equity literacy. We have to spend time learning what racism is, how it works, how it's impacting every single one of us, how the way that we think and behave works, why we do what we do. All of that is intersected because racism sits on top of those realities, and then being able to understand what are some of the tools that we can use to advance racial equity. The other skills that I'm going to mention very quickly are more about the human condition. Again, since racial equity sits on top of just the realities of what it means to be a human being and the challenges that come with that, it means we need to build our emotional intelligence, and not just know what it means, but to practice it. And that means that we have to learn some stuff so that we can put it into practice, which is an effort which is something that takes effort and intentionality. On the emotional intelligence side, we're talking about ourselves and we're talking about a relationship with other people. The other important one is communication. Our ability to listen is a skill as well, and to be able to do it in a way that is respectful of the person sitting in front of us, and we are able to create the space for them to say what they need to say, however they say it, and that we receive it as they mean it, and work hard to work through the process of figuring out what they mean, regardless of how we want them to say it, or how we expect them to say things to us. The other side of that is the piece around how we communicate with other folks, which relates to emotional intelligence and being considerate of other folks that are listening to what we're saying to them, and that we're genuine and authentic and honest in that. This idea of conflict management. Conflict is inevitable, it's important, and there is a such thing as productive conflict, and it helps us build stronger relationships with other people, and it helps us clarify where we sit on issues and things, but we have to go through the process, and it helps us come up at the end of the day with better ideas, products, and services. And then the last one is critical thinking. If we know that as humans we're flawed and we fall into logical and cognitive potholes on a regular basis, because we're all just people, then that means we need a process to understand our thinking and to manage it so that it's more logical. Our default is illogical, irrational. Critical thinking acknowledges that that's a reality for all of us, and that we have the ability to do this better, use best practices, be thoughtful, slow down, and really do the type of analysis that allows us to come out on the other end with logical, thoughtful approaches to the work. So thank you very much for having me. I appreciate all of you. And as always, sending lots of love, hope, and action to everyone as we transition to the question and answer period.
Love, hope, and action. I like that. Couple of key takeaways for me. We need to be in a consistent posture of practice in terms of how we're enacting with these issues. We're talking about equity because we have to address inequities. People's voice and choice have been taken from them as a result of the process. And outreach does not equal engagement. And I'm going to go deeper on that one, but I want to first send a question out via Slido to our participants. Participants, what is your reaction to this statement? People in Boston value equity. Strongly agree, somewhat agree, don't know, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree. So 50% somewhat agree, going back down, 60% somewhat agree, 40% somewhat disagree. Dr. Martin, I'm going to ask you to tackle that one because you're our Boston person, you're in the community there. What's your initial response to this reaction from our audience today? And it's switching, so.
It keeps moving, yeah. So I think the first piece is, so I agree that, that people in Boston value equity. A lot of people value equity in theory. The challenge that I've seen in Boston and around the country really is that we don't really know what equity means. And so we don't know how to do it. So we value it in principle because it seems like the right thing to do. But in practice, we're challenged, and it's easy for us to default back to, prioritizing our own individual needs or prioritizing needs of groups that we feel like we identify with or that we're a part of. And so figuring out how do we make sure that we are all clear about what it means to practice equity, which when we're working with organizations, one of the things we always talk about, which is the difference between our strategic direction, the mission, vision, values that we hold, it's like aspirational, versus the norms and standards, the things we do every day, the habits. And in many instances, those two things are not the same. And so the same thing applies here. What we do every day in practice does not align with the fact that we value equity.
So a couple of questions that have been percolating with me as I've heard you all speak. And so from my personal experience, right, I worked for a large affordable housing, public housing agency, and did tons of, I say, community engagement around our design processes. But I remember that, in my other life, I'm a lawyer too, right? And there were legal rules around what engagement needs to look like. And it could have been, in many instances, a check the box exercise. Send a letter 48 hours before the meeting, knowing nobody's going to show up. As you mentioned, Dr. Martin, around times, make sure it gets in people's mailboxes, in somewhat hope of people not being engaged. I can tell you from my experience, because I had that job, I wanted a packed room. I wanted as many people as I could get in the room to have these critical discussions because I wanted real engagement. I wanted the community and the lives that we were going to touch through our work to be a part of the process. So I would love to hear from you all about, there are rules and laws around what community engagement looks like. Obviously, does that hurt or enhance the process? And then what can we do when people feel they're tethered to merely following the law?
I'll start with it and see where it goes.
Okay.
So my perspective, and I've brought this to the Highline, is that engagement, similar to what you said, Atyia, in terms of equity, I think people think of it, community engagement, as community outreach. It's the lighter touch of the two processes. When I think of community engagement, I think of a spectrum of techniques, of tactics, of strategies that go all in, like co-design processes, user-centered design processes, that aren't kind of the ones that swoop in, helicopter in and helicopter out, that they continue. And there's like trust building piece.
Mhm.
And there's lighter touch pieces like, you can volunteer. That's still community engagement. There's still a relationship. There's outreach, there's organizing. There's all these kind of tactics, if you will, that are in the spectrum. I haven't done it from the city side or from the development side in some cases, where in New York City, it's called ULURP, where you're supposed to go through this process, this kind of city council mandated process or city mandated process around development projects. But I have worked with various cities around the country and around the world, really, around what can be done. And early on, cities would come back and say, oh, I have to do X. But they've never really asked the question as to why you have to do it that way. You can go deeper. It's just there is a lot of other bureaucratic pressure, there's political pressure, but there's an appetite. From the Highlands perspective, we're not necessarily, we don't have that kind of pressure on our hands. So for us, it's a long race, and the race really doesn't end. And so you need to know when to really kind of flex those different techniques within that spectrum to be able to get to not just what you need, what the organization needs, but also how we can actually meet people at least halfway there. It's not a tops-down approach. Sometimes it is a bottoms-up or a meet-in-the-middle approach, but you need to know which tactic. And it's not outreach, it's not organizing. And I think there's elements of that that you need to flex a little bit, but it's a little more, it goes a little deeper than that. And I think a lot of organizations, and I've worked for a lot of them, where outreach is, like you said, it's like the town hall, it's the flyer, or it's this little thing, and that's not going to get you what you or the community need for something to be successful.
I'll just add to Mauricio's comment that community engagement isn't linear. And I think we need to understand that our major systems of law and development and finance are infused with what Dr. Atyia was mentioning, of understanding that they come from an ideology and a perspective to achieve an end goal. And I really believe that we have to shift mental models in those places. And the way to do that is to show that it's not linear, that there are different tools and pedagogies, back to Mauricio's point, but that there has to be quantifiers, that we are moving the pendulum in a way that really isn't about checking a box, but is really disrupting structural conditions that, as we have been circling around, are an imposition to our humanity. It's no longer sustainable. And we have to leverage the power dynamics that we all bring to the table to say, maybe maybe it's beneficial that in addition to that letter in the mail and satisfying this requirement, maybe there's another contingency that's doing some other methodologies or applications, but that we all come together and sort of create a space that each of those trajectories can converge and learn from one another and listen, because there is a collateral consequence. And just look outside your window if you can, as to when we do it that way, we're not getting the value as what Dr. Martin's saying, the return on investment. And it's just return on investment, not in a dollar sense, but on our democracy and our humanity. It's very problematic. So I don't know why we have to develop a different way. It obviously has not worked.
Yeah, I'll say that having worked in city government, and when you talk about rules and laws and it creates a mindset, if we let it, right? If we let it, it creates a mindset that is very, that thinks that there's one objective way to do things, and that's the only way to do things. The problem is, it never is, and to April's point, it's not linear. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's long-term. Now, here's the challenge. How do we get folks with more leadership skills in government who can ask different questions, right? So if I show up in government and I see the rules and the list of things, and my default reaction is, oh, we can't do that because the rules say we can't do that. Or I can say, well, how can we make this happen though? is there some space in here for us to, maybe we won't get the exact thing that we're looking for, but we can get some progress in this area? And if we want to go to the next level of leadership, and how do I leverage my agency and my role in the organization to partner with folks in order to shift the fact that this thing even exists that's in the way of real progress? Right. So there are opportunities there that don't get taken advantage of because it requires us to think critically, for us to think creatively, and for us to partner. And sometimes we need inside outside strategies with community, because the things that are in their way are the same things that are in our way to get things done together.
You circle back nicely on your toolbox, right? Because if you don't have critical thinking, you don't have conflict management, which you may come across internal and external, and you don't have the emotional intelligence, you're just going to check the box, right? And so you have to have these tools in the toolbox to face up to some of these issues in a real way. A question that we've been talking about, and everybody kind of touched on this in their presentation, is COVID-19. And then the convergence with systemic racism. Obviously, we know systemic racism didn't happen as a result of the George Floyd incident, but George Floyd murder, I want to just be clear, but we know that it's now in the forefront. And so how has those two convergence of COVID-19 and systemic racism changed the conversation around the need for equitable design? And I want to say, we actually had this already scheduled, right? So we, Waterfront knew that this is something that we should be talking about, but many others weren't talking about this stuff. Many others are going to talk about it for the next 30 to 60 to 90 days and stop talking about it. So I guess my question to you is, how has it changed the conversation, but how can we continue to keep the conversation going around these issues?
I'll quickly start us off. I think it's really interesting that we were talking about this before the whole pandemic, and you raise a really important point, Shelley, because when it depends on your perspective, right? And I share personal connectivity so that it brings a humanistic component to this dialogue. We had a pandemic before. I reside in the Bronx. I come from the borough that was mostly impacted in COVID deaths. But what we had before was something called the AIDS pandemic in my community, of which my father succumbed to. So when I talk about where we're at, for us, the urgency, we don't have a plan B. It's always been there since who knows how long. And we have to understand that these are new weights that are placed in our community, because we are coming from a history of trauma, of the heroin epidemic that was criminalized in our community. On the heels of the heroin epidemic, we had the pandemic of the fires in our community. On the pandemic of the fires in our community, we had the crack epidemic in our community. On top of the crack epidemic, we had unprecedented violence. So how do we sustain that it's not a moment, but a movement? Because we have to look at the carnage as we're going down this path. And for some of us who have lived it and who have experienced it, we wonder why it isn't something that lends, and Eric Garner died in New York City. Why is that different from what we're experiencing now? And the investment, it goes back to investment in the narrative. What do we want to invest in to ensure that we have an alternative narrative to what's dominating what we're talking about?
And how has COVID-19 changed the conversation? It's funny because, I struggle with sometimes having these conversations and trying to remain only intellectual. And what I will say is, as a Black woman who identifies as African American, it's been painful to watch, actually. I know my family has lost several people because of COVID-19. Our extended family, neighbors, I mean, just so many people have been lost because of COVID-19. When George Floyd, so before George Floyd, there have been a number of folks who are trying to get folks to pay attention to the racial inequity, the disproportionate burden of COVID-19 on Black, Latinx, and Indigenous populations in this country. And it was really hard. When George Floyd happened, there was this huge pivot. And what I find fascinating about it, two things. One of the things COVID-19 has changed, one of the ways COVID-19 has changed the conversation is that people who couldn't see the inequities when you intersect COVID-19 with the disproportionate burden, and then you layer George Floyd on top of it, and then everything that's happened since. People who didn't believe it before, couldn't see it, didn't want to see it, where it was in our face. You could not turn anywhere and not see it, right? It was everywhere. And because of COVID-19, we were all locked in our homes for a long period of time. We weren't leaving at all. And so then you turn on the news, and now you're constantly consuming it, right? Even more than we would any other time. So that said, that's one lesson, which is that there are a lot of folks who didn't understand that. I know me as a Black woman, I struggled growing up with the idea that white people didn't understand what was going on. Like I didn't understand, because if I'm a kid, like, how can I get it and you don't? And what I learned through that process was that there's a quote that I came across, that if it's not your struggle, it's invisible to you. And I'll add to it, unless someone shows you. Mm-hmm. And so this moment has shown people things that were really hard to believe prior to. And then I think the other piece is the digital divide. It's almost like we forgot there was a digital divide all the way up until this point, even though there have been advocates who've been trying to get folks to pay attention to the inequities in access to broadband in urban communities, but also in rural communities, and being able to access the kind of technology that allows you to maximize that broadband connection, to do things like school and job searches, and to do your job, depending on what kind of job jobs are available. And then the last piece is when we talk about how the conversation has changed. I think a lot of people, I'll say it this way. April talked about the idea of people having to come to terms with what is happening. And one of the dangers, I think the reason why it's been so hard for us to come to terms with the profound daily impacts of racism on people of color in particular, and in this case, particularly Black people, because there's a unique anti-Black racism that happens, that there's a danger in comfort and there's a danger in conformity. And I think people are feeling uncomfortable, but it's that cognitive dissonance that creates the space for us to grow and evolve and learn. And so my hope is that this isn't a moment, that it's a movement, but really it's on us to make sure that happens. And I don't mean us on this panel or just the people watching, but it's on like all of us to make sure that actually translates into something long-term.
Mauricio, did you want to add anything additional to that question?
I mean, I'm fortunate to have Atyia and April on this panel, just in general, but the only thing I will say, and maybe it might be crass to say, but you can't throw money at this problem. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes in the past, maybe because the pandemic is ever present and there's no clear finish line, that money you can throw, I mean, how many billions of dollars have we spent to try to get to some sort of solution? It's going to take a long time, so you can't throw money on it. So, and oftentimes that was the solution. You know, you throw money at it, you hire a consultant or whatever it is, you can't do that here. And so I think it's something, what both of you said, we're living it, you see it, it's on your screen, it's outside. Yeah.
So the audience has been quite busy in Slido, and they had numerous questions for you. And so I want to make sure we're able to at least tackle 2 or 3 of their questions. So I may just ask one of you to answer depending on who they pose the questions for. So could we take the first Slido question?
Sure. The first question is for Mauricio. What steps do you take to rebuild the trust that the High Line is for everyone in the neighborhood when its success did lead to gentrification?
Wow, that's a tough one. So I think part of it, I mean, that the High Line's there. It's not going anywhere. I certainly don't hope it's going anywhere. And so for me, the first step for me is listening, getting to know people, going out. I'm wearing a few different hats at the moment, but that shouldn't deter me from going out and listening to not just what I call them the usual suspects say, the folks who usually are the ones that raise their hand, the ones that are not afraid of being vocal or about being the ones to share their input. I want to be able to hear and get to know folks who either don't have access, don't know about how to get access, have never been asked questions. And so that's what I've sort of been doing. I still need to go to the folks who are heavily engaged, but I need to continue to go to these new folks, these unusual suspects, and not just, we've talked about it a couple times, not just go to them once or twice or 3 times, but continuously go to them, little things that we might take for granted, like an email on their birthday or an email about, hey, did you hear about this event? Or just picking their brain about something that's happening in the neighborhood, or they know. And I think April or Atyia, one of you said that, like, I'm the interloper, right? I'm the guy who's working at the High Line. I don't live on the west. I don't live in, Fulton Houses or, Elliott Chelsea, or even, in even parts of west side of Manhattan. I'm from Jackson Heights, Queens. And so I need to learn, I need to be educated and about what the lay of the land is and how things operate. And the residents of the west side of Manhattan, the residents who've been traditionally not asked about their experience on the west side of Manhattan, particularly when you think of the High Line and how it changed the whole landscape, both economically, literally and figuratively, economically and otherwise. I need to learn from their insights. They're experts in their lived experience. They're experts in their community and the day-to-day aspect of it. So that to me is the first part, and that's a big part. And I think, Atyia, you mentioned, like, that work it takes time. It's deliberative. You're going to do it. You're going to keep doing it. Even when we make progress, you need to continue it. It's not linear, as April said. It's a cycle, and that cycle is about building trust. And we have some of it, but we need to continue to do more of it. And the last thing I'll say is, so we have this dialogue, that's deliberative process, but there needs to be something in return too, right? They need to see that we're talking the talk. And yes, we have that park there. You can go whenever you want, but there's something more there. And so that's kind of the things I hope to glean. And just in full disclosure, I've been at the High Line 9 months now. And I think more than half of it has been in quarantine. So I have a lot of work to do ahead of me. So I will come back and share some updates if you'll have me.
Absolutely. And so I think we're going to go to the next question for April. April, can you talk more about supporting residents becoming long-term stewards of projects? What resources, grants are available to residents after projects end? April?
I'm sorry, guys. I forgot to hit the unmute.
No worries, no worries. We're just glad you're with us.
The part of the process is that projects don't end, right? Because it's been, arguably how many centuries in the making, how much longer is it going to take? And good design systems and processes reemerge and are transitional. They adapt and they find new ways to come back in and swoosh in. So a big component of our process is launching WeLab spaces in communities that are within existing structures. So it's not like we come in, we open a WeLab, and we're going to have all this innovation and design talk. We're invited into communities, first of all. Our work, we don't volunteer ourselves. And second of all, we work with the existing experts and infrastructures there, the actual community members, like Dr. Martin said, who really invite us. So in Trenton, we created a WeLab space where it has a myriad of activities taking place that convene residents it's like a public library, people come in and out. And it was offered to us and to the community to be part of this process by a 5th generation Trentonian who has seen the evolution of Trenton. So again, we have been rubbing 2 coins together as a collective to really support this project, and it shouldn't be that way. And our goal is to really create and work with people like Mauricio and Dr. Martin and hopefully Shelley. How do we create the intentionality down the line with these projects where we can, I don't have C-suite access, right? I can't go into a boardroom and say, hey, write me that $1 million check. What we're asking for right now is how do we activate this? And how do we get the resources that then trickle down, not only into the projects, but into the contracting for equity that Mauricio and Atyia spoke about. So that's the long-term process. The information lives there. It doesn't sit on a shelf. It's very visualized and engaging. The exhibition is on full display. We've had thousands of people go into the Conservatory Mansion in Trenton to look at this information. So it's a whole process.
Thank you, April. And I want to get one last question in for Dr. Martin. So they look like they're competing. So the top one has 6. Okay, Dr. Martin, how do we best define equity to create a greater understanding? An elevator speech, a way to include it frequently.
That's a great question. I think there's 2 parts to it. One, so the short answer, for time's sake, is that equity is about addressing the gaps, the thinking, and when I say gaps, I mean resources and gaps. I mean resources and gaps, gaps in resources. The gaps in our understanding, gaps in action, gaps in policies. And so if we're going to do equity work, it's really about unlearning a lot of things that we didn't choose to learn. It's about reframing how we see ourselves based on that informed and reframed understanding. It's about being intentional with how we engage with each other. And it's about making sure that organizations are continuously improving the structure, systems, processes, and the people in it, right? Because organizations impact behavior within them. And that our policies all align. Ultimately, and that's kind of the process side. Impact side is that any of us as a person of color that you'll hear this a lot, that my outcomes aren't determined based on my race, right? But it's important to understand the process that gets us there.
Thank you for that. I want to give our panelists an opportunity, a 60-second or so opportunity for any final words or actions. I think when we have these conversations, people are looking for things that they can actually do or take away from these conversations. And I think these are starters, right? We're all in a posture of practice. We're all continuing to learn and deepen our understanding of these issues. So what can you share with our audience? Anything that they should be reading, anything that they should be looking at, anything that they should be doing after today's conversation? And we'll start with Mauricio.
Well, besides reading up on Atyia and April's work, I suggest I would say, like for going back to the kind of the premise of, designing for equity and engaging diverse communities, thinking about infrastructure reuse and what the High Line is and what so many, I think there was a question about a mine pit. There's resources that you can check out that we put together on how to think about that design process. I mentioned the 11th Street Bridge Park. Actually, the 11th Street Bridge Park, I mentioned it in my intro. They put together an equitable development plan. It's a community-centered, community-informed, community-led from the very beginning process. If you want to read about how good practices, best practices, effective process, because a lot of this is process. A lot of people don't like process, but process really helps kind of determine a lot of the outcomes we hope to achieve. I would recommend reading that or skimming their equitable economic development plan. And there's a few different resources on the Highline Network website that I would recommend that you could peruse through. But I'll leave you with that.
11th Street Bridge, I have to give a plug for. That's another a place that we funded. We have deep belief in the work that they did in that community and how they did it. And so shout out to them. April, any closing remarks for the audience?
I think the capital W, capital E has to see themselves as designers and stewards of something that I think we're all hovering over here is our democracy. And equity cannot exist if we don't build empathy, understanding, and healing. And no matter how you define democracy, something was planted in all of us at some point that we have to make malleable to fit what we believe in as human beings and what are principles that guide us. And I actively encourage people, even during COVID, there are resources, I shared one in the link, that this is becoming a real hot button conversation. And there have been people doing this work, particularly talking about the present day collateral consequences of policies like redlining that were formed around eugenics and race science to really, again, reinforce this geographical footprint that we're all trying to unpack. We need spaces to unpack, and I think we need to take our power dynamic hat and find a way to build camaraderie and leverage our identity with people so that we can really, as a we, capital W, capital E, begin to design what it really means to have a just and equitable human experience. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Martin, any final remarks?
Thank you. So I saw the last question, which was how do we talk to people about people who do not believe that inequities exist and help them understand. And so one of the things that I struggle with actually, and I work really hard to live by is not to fight oppression with oppression. Because we not all of us started at a place where we didn't know stuff and we went through a process. And so other people have not had the privilege of the pain and suffering and exhilaration of going through that process and then staying on that pathway. And so for us to be thoughtful and considerate of where people are coming from, and that at one point we didn't know the things that we know now. And I'll just adhere with Paulo Freire because he's awesome. As long as you have a dictionary next to you to look up some of the words, highly recommend Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. So one of the things, here's how we'll end. He said, to alienate human beings from their own decision-making is to change them into objects. And I think it's important that as we think about how we advance racial equity, that we keep that in mind. And as we think about engaging with other people and helping them grow and learn and evolve their understanding, that we keep that concept in mind. And then 2 more books for you. One is James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. If you don't, it's a thin book. And if you read nothing, read the first 10 pages, the letter to his nephew. And then the last book is Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. Let's see if we can get that in there. There we kind of go. But Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. The subtitle is Why We Justify Foolish Beliefs, Bad Decisions, and Hurtful Acts. These are the kind of things that are a combination of understanding racism, oppression, and who we are as people and why we do what we do and how we can be better and do better.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for making the time for this discussion. Thank you for sharing the resources with the audience. And thank you for starting this discussion. I'm excited because I know this is one in a series of conversations that are going to be had. And I encourage everyone to take the information that our panelists, Mauricio, April, and Dr. Martin have shared with us today and go forth and learn more and ask questions and continue the conversation. And so I'm going to turn it over to Nick for closing remarks. And again, thank the trustees and One Waterfront for the opportunity for TD to sponsor such an impactful conversation.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I, again, would just also like to extend my gratitude to all of our panelists, April D. Simone, Dr. Atyia Martin, and Mauricio Garcia. Thank you, Shelley, for moderating, and to TD Bank and the TD Ready Commitment for your support this evening. We hope you will join us for our next Building One Waterfront event on October 22nd, where we will explore funding a resilient, sustainable waterfront for future generations. To learn more about it, please go to our website, onewaterfront.com. And most importantly this evening, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your time and participation. Thank you all. Have a good night.